They said Ironwood Forest kept its secrets. They were wrong. A battle-scarred veteran and his black Mustang were about to find one of those secrets hanging from a tree. A young ranger, bound and bleeding, whispered a name with her last breath. And in that moment, a quiet life was shattered. What followed would tear through the silence of the woods, drag a dark corruption into the light, and shake an entire town to its core. The first light of spring crept quietly over Ironwood Forest, a silver haze clinging to the ground like smoke from an unseen fire. The air smelled of thawed earth and rotting wood, the kind of damp weight that promised life but still held the chill of winter. A mile from the timberline stood an old homestead, weathered to the color of ash. From the road it looked abandoned, but someone lived here. Elias Mercer, 44 years old, carried himself like a man who had walked too far and seen too much. The lines on his face weren't just from age. They were carved by strain and by a silence that had settled deep in his bones. Once, Elias wore the uniform of the cavalry. Afghanistan, Iraq. Names stamped on briefing papers and burned into his mind. He'd ridden patrols through mountain passes where the thunder of hooves and gunfire became a single deadly rhythm. He'd lost men. He'd lost friends. He'd lost a part of himself out there on those ridges. Now he wore no uniform, just canvas work shirts and boots that had been resold too many times to count. He lived on odd jobs, splitting wood for neighbors, hauling lumber in exchange for salt, fuel, coffee, enough to keep the place standing, not enough to matter. He lived by a simple rule he repeated to himself in the dark of night. No weapons, no entanglements, no memories. He preferred the company of his land, his tools, and above all, his horse. Ranger was a Mustang, black as coal, tall and heavy in the chest. A jagged scar ran along his left flank, a souvenir from the same war that had scarred Elias. The army had used him for patrols in rough country. After an ambush, handlers left him for dead, riddled with shrapnel. But Elias, already bleeding himself, refused to leave him. He dragged Ranger to shelter, bound his wound, and walked with him for miles until they both collapsed. They had survived together. From that moment on, Ranger wasn't just an animal. He was a partner. Now, years later, the horse followed him like a shadow. Ranger was the first to sense a shifting wind, the first to hear a coyote in the dark. If the woods fell unnaturally silent, Ranger would stiffen long before Elias heard a thing. Together, they shared the quiet life of outcasts. But the nights betrayed him. The dreams always came back in jagged flashes. Darkness split by gunfire, men screaming through radio static, the metallic scream of an IED, the ground erupting beneath him. He always woke the same way, shirt clinging to his skin, breath ragged. And every time Ranger would be there, his dark eyes steady as if to say, "We are still here. We survived." Elias had come to Ironwood to bury himself in quiet work, to let the world forget him. But he knew. Deep down, Elias Mercer knew the past was not done with him. The morning broke clear and cold. Mist lingered in low swirls. Elias stepped out from the porch, his jacket drawn tight. Ranger was waiting in the corral, stamping the dirt, his dark coat glistening like whetstone. It was a ritual, like any other morning. Check the saddle straps twice, tug the cinch, slide the hunting knife into its sheath. Never step into the woods without the tools that might carry you back. The day felt no different. Quiet, steady, predictable. He had no reason to think it would become anything else. They hadn't gone far before Ranger stopped. The horse's stride slowed, then halted completely. His ears swiveled sharply, his mane tossing as he snorted at the air. His hooves struck the ground with short, nervous thuds. "What is it, boy?" Elias muttered, easing the reins. The Mustang refused to move. His body was stiff, his breath quickening, his eyes rolling white toward a narrow path that veered off the main trail. It was little more than a deer track, overgrown and shadowed. Elias frowned. Ranger was no stranger to the wild. Predators, storms, even gunfire had failed to shake him before. But now, for the first time in years, the animal was afraid. Elias slid from the saddle. He rested a hand on the horse's shoulder, feeling the tense muscle beneath the skin. The Mustang's heart hammered fast. The veteran's instinct stirred. He remembered how animals sensed danger before men did. He trusted Ranger's fear more than he trusted the silence of the woods. Leading the horse by the reins, Elias advanced slowly. His eyes swept the undergrowth, scanning every shadow. He was trained to notice what didn't belong. The break of a twig, an unnatural angle of a branch. It was a glint of wetness that caught his eye first. On a moss-covered rock lay a streak of dark red, smeared in a way that gravity could not explain. Elias crouched, touching the stain. It was sticky. The mark was too high off the ground to be an animal. It was human. He straightened slowly. Ranger pulled back on the reins, letting out a sharp, low neigh. Elias followed the sound toward a thicket of damp leaves. Something green lay half hidden beneath them. He pushed the branches aside. The sight stopped him cold. It was a ranger's cap, dark green cloth with the embroidered crest of the Ironwood Service. The brim was crushed. The side was streaked with dried blood. He had seen enough caps like it. Symbols of duty, of order. To find one here, abandoned and bloodied, was not an accident. Something violent had happened here. He drew the hunting knife from its sheath. The steel caught the pale morning light, cold and ready. "Easy," he whispered to Ranger, though the reassurance was as much for himself. Together they edged deeper into the shadow trail. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Birds had gone silent. Even the wind died. Elias knew this silence. He had felt it in mountain passes overseas, right before the ambush. It was the silence of waiting, the pause before violence. He rounded a stand of cedar and froze. Suspended between two trees, hanging upside down, was a body. The figure swayed gently in the faint stir of wind. Boots bound tight by a coarse rope looped over a thick branch. Elias's chest constricted. This wasn't a battlefield in some foreign land. This was Ironwood. He stepped closer, heart pounding. It was a woman. Her hair was matted, covering half her face. A dark green uniform clung to her frame, torn and streaked with dirt. The familiar insignia of the Ironwood Forest Service was still visible on her shoulder, darkened with blood. Her name tag glimmered faintly. Whitfield. Clara Whitfield. He'd seen her in town. Young, sharp, dedicated. Now she hung like a broken doll from the trees. Elias clenched his jaw. This was an execution, a warning. He scanned the tree line. No movement. Still, he knew better than to assume he was alone. Whoever had done this might still be watching. He needed to get her down. Fast. He pulled the leather lariat from Ranger's saddle, looped one end around an opposite branch, and began to climb. His shoulders burned, but old muscle memory guided him. When he reached the branch, he balanced carefully, knife in hand. He secured the lariat beneath Clara's bound ankles, easing the tension onto the new rope. Then he set his jaw and cut. The coarse rope snapped. Clara's body dropped a foot, but the lariat caught her weight. Elias lowered her hand over hand until she rested on the damp needles below. He dropped from the branch and knelt at her side. Ranger moved in close, a protective shadow over her. She was breathing, barely. Her lips were cracked, her breaths shallow. Dirt streaked her face and blood had clotted along a gash at her temple. He pressed two fingers to her throat, a weak pulse. Relief flickered through him, fragile as a candle in the wind. He tore strips from his shirt and bound her shoulder tight to slow the bleeding. The habits of battlefield triage returned without thought. A low groan slipped from her lips. Her body shuddered, eyelids fluttering. "Easy," he said softly. "You're safe. I've got you." Her eyes cracked open, wild with fear. She tried to struggle. "No," she rasped. "No, don't. I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice firm but calm. At that moment, Ranger stepped forward, lowering his massive head until his muzzle brushed Clara's hand. The horse exhaled softly, warm breath against her skin. Her eyes shifted to the horse, and some of the panic ebbed. Her lips parted, words spilling out in fragments. Don't trust them." Her gaze locked on his. "At the station, Reeves." Her voice cracked. "They're not just cutting trees. They're burying secrets." Her eyes rolled back. She collapsed into unconsciousness. Body limp once more. Elias's jaw clenched. Reeves, Dalton Reeves, the chief ranger of Ironwood. A man respected, a man others deferred to without question. And what did she mean? Burying secrets? This was bigger than illegal logging. Far bigger. Every instinct told him to walk away, return to his cabin, and pretend he had never found her. He had lived for years by that creed. Stay detached. Stay invisible. But he couldn't. Not this time. He lifted her carefully into his arms. He secured her across the saddle, binding her gently to keep her steady. The soldier in him was fully awake now, scanning for ambushes, weighing every rustle of a leaf. "Let's get her out of here, boy," he murmured. As the mist closed in behind them, he knew his life of isolation was over. He carried a woman's life, and with it, a secret that could shatter ironwood. A secret far darker than the stolen timber. The homestead came into view, gray boards against dark timber. Elias pushed through the warped door and laid Clara gently on the narrow bed. The room was dim, a fire smoldering in the hearth. He needed help, more than his old battlefield tricks could provide. He sent word through the only person in town he trusted, Ruth Callahan, the saloon owner. An hour later, a knock came at the back door. Marisol Vega stepped inside, shaking dust from her boots. She was a field veterinarian, tall with dark, unwavering eyes that moved instantly to Clara. Her faded white coat was threadbare, pockets bulging with the tools of her trade. Needles, antiseptic, bandages meant for animals, but ready for human service when necessity demanded. "She's bad," Marisol said, her voice sharp. "She's alive," Elias answered. Marisol set to work with practiced efficiency. She examined the gash on Clara's shoulder. Deep. Someone cut her. This was no fall. She cleaned the wound, her movements precise. She checked for bruises, rope burns, dehydration. Finally, she sat back on her heels. "If you hadn't found her, Elias, we'd be digging a grave." Elias said nothing, his face unreadable except for the tightness around his eyes. It was past noon when Clara stirred. Panic flashed in her eyes. She tried to rise, but gasped as pain shot through her shoulder. "Easy," Elias said. "You're safe here." Her gaze darted around the small cabin. Through the open window, Ranger's dark head appeared, a soft wicker rumbling in his chest. A faint smile touched Clara's lips. "Ranger," she whispered. But then her eyes sharpened, memory flooding back. She turned to Elias, her voice raw. "I saw them." "Who?" "Our own people," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Badges, uniforms." She told them everything. The patrol on North Ridge, finding something deep in the timber, off the maps. Not just fresh cuts of old-growth cedar, but something else. Mounds of freshly turned earth. Too many of them. Too neat. "I tried to report it," she said, her hands trembling. "They laughed. Told me to let it go. Said it was bigger than me." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I went back to take pictures. That's when they came. Men I knew. Colleagues. They cornered me, knocked me down, tied my wrists, said I should have kept my mouth shut." A tear welled but didn't fall. "Before I blacked out, I heard the name. Dalton Reeves." The name hung in the air like smoke, but it was what she said next that chilled them to the bone. "They weren't just burying timber, Elias. I saw something, a piece of cloth, sticking out of the dirt." Her breath hitched. It was the sleeve of a jacket, a ranger's jacket. Marisol's face went white. Her own brother, a ranger, had vanished without a trace 2 years ago. The official report said he got lost in a storm. She never believed it. Now she knew why. Elias rose and crossed to Clara's backpack. He set it on the table. Inside were the usual things: a knife, a canteen, rolled maps. But his fingers found a hidden zipper at the bottom seam. He tugged it open. Inside was a map with a faint pencil mark showing a trail that didn't exist on any official record. "It was bait," Clara rasped from the bed. "They sent me there on purpose." Beneath the map lay a small black object, a USB drive, the kind clipped to a body camera. Elias plugged it into his battered laptop. Static filled the screen, then a shaky image appeared. Trees close and crowded. Clara's breathing fast and loud. Then a man's voice off camera. "Over here, Whitfield. Take that path." Elias froze. He knew that voice. Deputy Cole Harmon. On the screen, the camera turned. catching a glimpse of Harmon at the edge of the trail, motioning her forward. Moments later, the struggle. The frame twisted, voices overlapping, a sharp protest from Clara. Then the sound of a heavy blow, a muffled grunt, and the screen went black. Elias pulled the USB free. It felt heavier than steel in his palm. He looked at Marisol, whose eyes burned with a terrible fire. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. This was about murder. And Marisol's brother was likely the first victim. "What's on the rest of the drive?" Marisol asked, her voice tight. "It's encrypted," Elias said, pointing to a single file icon. "Trying to open it could be a trap." "We have to know," Clara insisted, pushing herself up. "It's the only proof we have." Elias hesitated, his gut screaming at him, but he saw the look in their eyes. He clicked the file. For a second, nothing happened. Then a single line of text appeared on the screen. "Signal sent, signal sent, a trap." It was a digital tripwire. They knew exactly where he was. Outside, Ranger let out a piercing whinny that tore through the quiet clearing. The horse stamped hard, nostrils flaring. Trouble was no longer coming. It was here. It began with a whisper of movement, the faint scuff of boots against earth, then a silence that was too deliberate. Ranger's head snapped up. A long, piercing neigh tore across the clearing, a sharp, undeniable alarm. Elias was already moving. He doused the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness broken only by the hearth's glow. "Barricade the door, now." Marisol and Clara shoved the heavy oak table against the doorframe. Through the window, Elias saw them. 4 figures in forest camo, faces hidden by dark mass, advancing through the grass. A pistol glimmered in the moonlight. The first strike came fast. Glass shattered as a masked man slammed a crowbar through the window. He reached for the sill, trying to pull himself through. Outside, a second attacker crept toward the corral, raising a length of chain. But Ranger met him head-on. The Mustang reared high, hooves flashing. He struck down with a violent crash, sending the man sprawling into the dirt. The horse whinnied again, a fierce, primal battle cry. In the yard, Elias had drawn his revolver. He slid behind a stack of wood. The first shot cracked through the night, a warning. The masked men dove for cover. Gunfire answered, flashes sparking in the dark. Bullets tore chips from the cabin's walls. Elias ducked low, rolling as a slug splintered the crate he'd been crouched behind. His pulse hammered, steady and controlled. The combat rhythm returned as if it had never left. One of the attackers rushed the door, slamming a shoulder into it. The barricade rattled but held. He drew back to strike again, then staggered, clutching his arm. Elias's bullet had found its mark. Another tried to flank, firing wild. A bullet smacked into the beam beside Elias, spraying him with splinters. He rolled, came up on one knee and fired twice. The second shot struck true, biting into the man's leg. He fell with a scream. At the broken window, a third man tried to climb in. Before he could swing through, Ranger charged the wall, slamming his body hard against the exterior. The impact rattled the frame, throwing the intruder off balance. He crashed backward into the dirt. Elias rose from cover, his voice ringing through the chaos. "Leave this land or die on it." The words cut through the night, raw and absolute. For the first time, hesitation flickered among the attackers. They had expected a frightened woman and a worn-out veteran. They found a fortress, a horse that fought like a demon, and a man who met them with fire and fury. The fight broke. They grabbed their wounded comrades and pulled back into the trees, but not before one of them shouted a warning. "Stay out of Reeves's business. This is your last chance." Then they were gone. The clearing fell silent, the smell of gunpowder and blood hanging in the air. Elias stood in the yard, revolver lowered. Ranger pawed the ground, chest heaving. Elias laid a calming hand on the horse's neck, grounding them both. The cabin door creaked open. Marisol stood framed in the fire's glow, Clara pale at her side. As Elias turned, his boot kicked something in the mud. He bent down. It was a small, ornate silver lighter, the kind you don't find in a place like Ironwood. Engraved on the side was a corporate logo he didn't recognize, and a single initial, B. This was bigger than Reeves. Someone else, someone with money was pulling the strings. Reeves had sent his dogs, and war had come to Ironwood. Dawn seeped into the clearing, washing over the battered homestead. Smoke lingered in the air. Elias stood by the window, revolver resting on the sill. He hadn't slept. Clara stirred on the couch, her eyes burning. "This place won't hold," she said, her voice certain. "They'll be back." "Then we have to go to them," Marisol declared, her face grim. She held up the silver lighter. "This logo, I've seen it before, on trucks passing through town late at night, belongs to a company called Blackridge Timber. They're supposed to be a legitimate logging operation, but rumors say they buy land and strip it bare, leaving poison in the soil." Clara pushed herself upright, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. 10 years ago, there was a lookout tower up north. After a big fire, it was abandoned. That's where I first saw the trucks. That's where the graves are. I know it. Ilias turned from the window. Her expression held no doubt. The attack had proven it. Reeves wasn't just hiding illegal logging. He was covering up murders for a powerful corporation. He nodded once. "Then we go." They left the homestead behind and disappeared into the waking woods. The forest greeted them with cool air and low-hanging mist. Clara, mounted on Ranger, guided them. The soil was scarred with deep grooves from heavy tires. Fresh sawdust lay scattered against the damp ground. "They're getting bold," Clara muttered. "They don't even bother covering their tracks." Ranger snorted, ears flicking back, his body restless. He knew they were walking into the heart of the danger. By midday they reached the tower. It rose crooked against the sky, a blackened skeleton of wood and steel. The place smelled of old ash and decay. "This is it," Clara whispered. Elias paced the ruins, a cigarette butt still white at the tip, a boot print, its edges crisp. "Someone's been here recently," he said, his gaze narrowing. Ranger stopped moving. The horse lowered his head, pawing at the earth. He paced a tight circle, then returned to the same spot, striking the ground again with his hoof. Elias crouched where Ranger signaled. He brushed away a mat of dead leaves. Beneath lay a slab of metal, rusted and flush with the soil. A hollow echo came back when he knocked on it. "It's a hatch," he murmured. Clara's breath caught. Elias wedged a crowbar beneath the lip and heaved. With a screech of tearing metal, the hatch swung open, releasing a rush of cold, damp air that smelled of sap and mold. The darkness below seemed to swallow the light. The ladder groaned under their weight as they descended, Elias's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The chamber below was carved from earth and stone, its walls reinforced with heavy timbers. Rows of crates filled the space, stacked nearly to the ceiling. Each was branded with strange markings, slashes and cross hatches burned into the wood. Elias pried one open. It was filled with planks of polished cedar. "This is what I found," Clara said. "This is industrial," Elias agreed. "Organized." Marisol scanned the walls. "They've been moving stock through here for years." But her flashlight beam caught something else. Not just crates. In the far corner of the chamber, under a canvas tarp, were stacks of metal barrels. They were leaking a dark, oily substance that pooled on the stone floor. The barrels were stamped with the same Blackridge Timber logo from the lighter. "This isn't just about timber," Marisol whispered, her voice filled with horror. "They're poisoning the forest, the water." And then Elias saw it. At the back of the chamber, behind the leaking barrels, the dirt floor was disturbed. A series of long, rectangular mounds. Graves. He didn't have to dig to know what he would find. Marisol let out a choked sob, sinking to her knees. Her brother was here, buried under tons of earth and corporate poison. This was the secret. The logging, the murders. It was all to protect this toxic dump site. Blackridge was using Ironwood Forest as its personal graveyard, and Reeves was their undertaker. As they turned to leave, Elias's light caught the wall near the entrance. Carved into the stone were marks, deep intersecting lines etched in patterns. "I saw these before," Clara said. "They're sigils, codes for timber loads, routes, destinations." "Smugglers use them to mark shipments," Marisol added, her eyes narrowing. "Only insiders know how to read them." Clara's jaw set. "I watched Reeves stand in front of these marks once, studying them like a ledger. He knew exactly what they meant." Elias swept the beam across the wall. Dozens of symbols, each a record of theft, poison, and murder. A silent archive carved in stone. He turned to them, his face a mask of grim resolve. This is the heart of it. Reeves's empire. Now we bring it down. They climbed back into the daylight, the hatch groaning shut behind them. They had the truth. Now they just had to live long enough to tell it. They stopped only long enough to breathe. Beneath an ancient cedar, Marisol pulled out her battered laptop. The signal from her satellite router was weak, a thin pulse, but it was enough. She copied the footage from the USB and the photos they'd taken of the crates, the barrels, the graves. She addressed the email to a name she had kept for 2 years, Jonah Blackthorne, a freelance journalist who had made enemies in every state office worth naming. A man who once exposed a timber baron and lived to tell the story. She attached the files and typed 3 words in the subject line. Evidence. Reeves, Ironwood. Evidence. Reeves, Ironwood. The progress bar inched forward. Then the screen flashed. Message sent. Message sent. Marisol snapped the laptop shut. They'll know soon enough, she whispered. We have to move. Elias nodded grimly. Then we move. Miles away at the ranger station, the message hit Reeves's network like a lightning strike. An ally in the state telecom office forwarded him the alert. He saw the subject line. He saw the recipient. His face flushed crimson. He slammed his fist on the desk. They think they can run, he muttered. He rounded on Deputy Cole Harmon, who lingered nervously by the window. Reeves's voice was pure venom. Call the boys, every last one. Block the ridge, the logging road, the creek crossing. Wire the game trails. If they try to breathe, choke them. If they try to hide, burn them out. Harmon swallowed hard. And if the files spread? Reeves leaned close, his whisper colder than the storm building outside. Then bury them in the woods before the truth ever sees the sun. The storm arrived with fury. The sky turned the color of bruised steel. Winds surged through the trees, bending the pines until they groaned. Then came the rain, sheets of water that blurred the forest into a shifting wall of gray. Ranger pressed forward without falter. Ilias hunched low, his arm braced around Clara. Marisol trudged close behind. The forest was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. Ranger stopped suddenly, his body rigid. Elias slid from the saddle. Stretched low across the trail was a glint of wire, thin as a hair, set at chest height to tear a rider from his saddle. Damn them! Elias growled, slicing it with his knife. They want us dead, Clara said, her voice shaking with fury. Moments later, the earth crumbled beneath Marisol's boot. Elias yanked her back just as a pit lined with sharpened stakes gaped open. A whistle cut through the storm. Sharp, deliberate. Another answered from deeper in the trees. Signals, hunters circling their prey. Figures emerged from the rain, cloaked in dark ponchos, faces masked, rifles raised. Move! Elias barked. He helped Marisol onto Ranger's back behind Clara. He swung into the saddle just as bullets cracked through the downpour. Ranger lunged into the trail, hooves pounding mud. Behind them, shouts rose, followed by more gunfire. The forest rang with it, like war drums. Elias twisted in the saddle, firing back, forcing their pursuers into cover. The Mustang tore through the storm like living thunder. The creek, swollen with rainwater, raged white over jagged rocks. Hold tight, Elias warned. Ranger gathered himself and leapt. For a heartbeat, they hung suspended above the torrent, then landed with a jarring crash on the opposite bank. The path narrowed along a ridge, a sheer drop on one side. A figure stepped from the brush ahead, rifle raised. It was one of Harmon's men. He fired. The shot ricocheted off the stone wall, stinging Elias's cheek. Elias fired back. The man staggered, crumpling against the wall. Then lightning split a towering pine ahead. With a crack like gunfire, the tree toppled, crashing across the trail, blocking their path. No choice, Elias cursed. He spurred Ranger forward. The horse surged, and with a tremendous leap, cleared the fallen trunk. They landed hard, stumbling but staying upright. Behind them, the storm swallowed the sound of pursuit. They rode on, breath ragged, muscles screaming. But still, Ranger carried them, a dark streak against the tempest, his spirit refusing to surrender. In the small clearing ahead, Elias slowed him. Rain sheeted down, washing mud from their clothes. They won't stop, Clara whispered. Elias scanned the dripping trees, revolver still in hand. His jaw was set like stone. Neither will we. Ranger shook his mane and let out a fierce, defiant neigh that rang through Ironwood like a challenge to the heavens themselves. The storm had thinned to a bitter drizzle when they stumbled out of the trees. Before them stood the old Pinerist broadcast tower, a rusted skeleton against the night sky. A piece of loose steel clanged in the wind like a broken bell. "If there's any life left in that system," Clara whispered, "this is our last chance." Elias scanned the tree line. The forest didn't feel empty. It felt like it was watching. Inside the crumbling control shack, Marisol went straight to work, pulling wires and a hand-sized power pack from her kit. "Help me with the antenna," she said sharply. Elias stood guard at the doorway, revolver in hand, his eyes on the shifting dark. Ranger moved like a shadow behind him. The old machine hummed faintly when Marisol connected the lines. A single light flickered on the console. Static hissed into the room. For long minutes it seemed hopeless. Then a voice cut through. Female, firm, low. "This is Special Agent Dana Holt, Forest Service Federal Division. Identify yourself." Clara's breath caught. She grabbed the mic. "Clara Whitfield, Ranger Division Ironwood. I'm with Elias Mercer and Dr. Marisol Vega. We have proof Chief Reeves is running an illegal operation for Black Ridge Timber. He's covering up murders and a toxic dump site. He tried to kill us. We need immediate extraction." Silence. Then a steady reply. "Copy that. We have your ping. A helicopter is inbound. ETA 45 minutes. Hold your ground." Elias didn't relax. 45 minutes is a lifetime," he said, his voice flat. "They'll know where we are now." Ranger stamped his hoof in agreement. The attack came with lightning. A bolt split the night sky, lighting the clearing white as bone. In that flash, Elias saw them. Figures slipping from the tree line. Rifles raised, closing fast. "Down!" he barked. The first shot shattered the doorway. Elias answered with two of his own, forcing them into cover. Bullets pinged off the tower's legs, ricocheting in sharp sparks. One of the attackers broke through the brush, charging Ranger with a pistol drawn. The Mustang met him with fury, rearing up and striking down with such force, the man screamed and dropped his weapon. Ranger pressed forward, driving him back into the dirt. Elias's voice cut across the chaos. "You don't touch them while I still breathe." The fight became a storm of its own. Gunfire rattled against the tower's frame. Elias fired methodically, moving between the doorway and a rusted support beam, never staying still. One man tried to rush the shack, but Elias caught him in the leg. Marisol dragged Clara behind a cabinet as shards of concrete flew. Between bursts of gunfire, she clutched the radio, shouting, "We're under attack! We need that helicopter now!" Holt's voice broke through the static, clipped and calm. "Hold on! 10 minutes out!" Sweat ran down Elias's brow. His revolver clicked empty. He reloaded, his fingers steady despite the chaos. He staggered as a round grazed his shoulder, pain burning sharp and deep. Marisol saw the blood and ripped a strip of cloth from her bag, binding his arm as he fired over her shoulder. "You can't bleed out on me," she hissed. "Not planning on it," he gritted. But then he saw him. Through the rain and muzzle flashes, a new figure stepped into the clearing. Larger than the others, moving with a cold, brutal purpose. It was Reeves, and he was holding a shotgun. The first sign of salvation was a deep, rhythmic thump that cut through the storm. The helicopter tore across the sky, its floodlights sweeping the treetops, turning rain to silver. Ranger reared, not in fear, but in fierce recognition. "We're here!" Clara shouted into the radio. The machine descended, blasting the grass flat. Federal agents spilled out, weapons raised. At their head strode a tall woman in tactical black. "Special Agent Dana Holt," she barked. "Cover the civilians." Reeves saw his chance slipping away. He raised the shotgun, aiming not at the agents, but at Clara in the doorway. He was going to silence her for good. But Elias was faster. He threw himself in front of her, taking the full blast of the shotgun in his side. He crumpled to the ground, the world fading to a roar. Through the haze of pain, he saw Ranger charge. The Mustang, a vision of black fury, slammed into Reeves, knocking the chief off his feet. The shotgun clattered away. Before Reeves could recover, Holt's agents were on him, pinning him to the muddy ground. Silence fell over the clearing. Elias lay half-conscious as Marisol frantically worked on his wound. He was half-dragged, half-carried toward the helicopter. Ranger galloped alongside, nudging his hand. Inside, the noise was deafening, but for the first time in days, they were safe. Clara slumped against Marisol, sobbing with relief. Elias leaned his head back, eyes closed, as Ranger paced the cargo hold, a silent, furious guardian. They had survived the impossible. By morning, the storm had passed. At the regional command center, Agent Holt wasted no time. She stood before a hall of stunned agents and reporters. The screen came to life. The body cam footage. The photos of the graves, the leaking barrels, the Black Ridge logo. "This is not speculation," Holt said, her voice like iron. "This is proof of a conspiracy that has poisoned land and taken lives, protected by men sworn to uphold the law." At its center stands Chief Dalton Reeves and his corporate partners at Black Ridge Timber. The silence in the room was suffocating. That afternoon, Ironwood watched as federal SUVs lined the street. Holt stepped forward, papers in hand. "Dalton Reeves, you are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and murder." Reeves's face twisted. "I am Ironwood's law." "The law has spoken," Holt said, "louder than you ever could." The cuffs closed around his wrist with an audible click. As he was led away, he saw the faces of the neighbors he had deceived, the community he had betrayed. For the first time, he had nothing left to say. The courthouse overflowed. Clara Whitfield, sling on her arm, took the stand. Her voice, steady and clear, recounted the horror. Elias, his side heavily bandaged, spoke next. His testimony was plain, brutal, and unshakable. Reeves's lawyer tried to discredit them. "Soldiers' stories," he sneered. "Convenient testimony from a traumatized woman." Then the bailiff opened the doors. A collective gasp swept the gallery as Ranger stepped inside. His black coat gleamed, hooves clicking on the polished floor. He moved with a deliberate grace, head held high. The entire courtroom fell into reverent silence. Ranger stopped near the witness stand, lowering his head beside Clara. He stood like a sentinel, a living testament to everything they had endured. In the back, a child's voice rose in awe. "The hero horse." The spell broke. The trial was no longer just about Reeves's crimes. It was about what had endured in the face of them. Truth, loyalty, and the will to stand. And Reeves, shackled and silent, finally lowered his eyes. He was broken. The town of Ironwood reeled, but in the rubble of doubt, something new began to grow. They created the Rangers' Oath Fund, a pledge to support honest wardens and stand behind anyone who dared confront the rot. A tall wooden board was raised in the square, and townsfolk lined up to sign their names, a vow that Ironwood would never be silenced again. Weeks passed. Clara Whitfield stood before her neighbors, no longer a broken victim, but the new captain of the Ironwood Patrol. "I was silenced once," she said, her voice ringing with strength. "But I promise you, no one in Ironwood will ever be forced into silence again." Applause rolled like thunder. Across town, Marisol Vega opened the doors to the Ironwood Haven, a veterinary and rescue clinic built by the community, a place where every comrade, two-legged or four, could heal. Ranger stood in the largest stall, his scar a mark of honor, as children pressed against the rails to touch the hero horse. Elias Mercer, the man who once lived in solitude, now led patrols of young recruits, teaching them the language of the forest. He became their silent guardian. One evening, Ruth Callahan appeared at his gate with a thin, pale girl. "This is Sammy," Ruth said gently. "Her father was one of the honest rangers. Reeves buried his death in lies. She's been on her own ever since." Sammy stared with guarded eyes. Then Ranger stepped forward, lowering his head until his mane brushed her cheek. The girl hesitated, then reached up a trembling hand. A small, fragile smile touched her lips. Elias opened his arms and Sammy stepped into them. The silent cabin was now a home. Months later, on a quiet night, Elias stood outside. Ranger grazed nearby. Beside him stood Clara, strong in her new uniform, and Sammy clutching his hand. The town lay in the distance, lights twinkling. Ranger lifted his head and released a piercing neigh that echoed through the forest. It was no longer just the cry of a horse. It was a declaration. The truth could be scarred and beaten, but it could never be destroyed. Ironwood, scarred but alive, had stepped into a new dawn, its hope guarded by courage, memory, and the oath that truth would never again be silenced. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit that notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.